You want the honors?
Is that cool?
Do it, please.
All right. Welcome to the Controversial Exchange. Today, our first reaction podcast, I guess. I'm pretty stoked on this. So all the credit goes to Dimitri. He was like, hey, man, like, what if we did this style to where we just played something? We kind of added our commentary around it. So today, one of the last, or maybe the last
8 days before he died.
Yeah, public lecture of B.F. Skinner when he was at the APA convention. So maybe set some of the context as to what he was doing there.
He won the Lifetime Achievement Award at the APA annual convention. This is on August 10th, 1990. And it's about a 20-minute speech he gives on his journey, behavior analysis, psychology, science. It's just an interesting thing to see, like, where, like, this literally was 8 days before he died. So what he has to say before his death, and what lessons we can take from it, and what we, just listen to it and see what it has to say.
Yeah.
Just respond to it kind of like novelly in the moment, man.
Yeah, we're just going to play, pause. Join us on this journey.
Yeah.
Let's go for it, man.
We got a couple of these plans, so hopefully people like it, because we're going to get a couple of them. All right. Oh, hold on. I accidentally paused my recording.
What'd you do that for?
Well, because I pressed the space bar. It's just the nice, like, reading rainbow music from back in the day.
That music.
It's so awesome.
On August 10th, 1990, in Boston, Massachusetts, B.F. Skinner received the American Psychological Association's Special Presidential Citation for lifetime contributions to psychology. On this occasion, he delivered the keynote address for the 98th Annual Convention of the APA.
This association has always been very good to me. I went to my first meeting in 1932. Most of you were not yet born, I suppose. My paper was on schedules of reinforcement, believe it or not, and it was at the very end of the program, and almost everyone had gone home. But one person who stayed was Richard M. Elliott, who 4 years later gave me my first job at the University of Minnesota.
What a different world to be living in, where you were actually presenting on a paper and then you got a job.
Yeah, right. There was no demand for your expertise on the market. You couldn't job hop. You couldn't get that $10,000, $20,000 bonus for signing on to somewhere.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott. Oh, man, great.
Later, the association provided space for a conference on the experimental analysis of behavior that some of my friends and I had organized, and that became, of course, Division 25. Somewhere along the line, I also received your...
Division 25, for those who don't know, is the behavior analysis section of the American Psychological Association. So there actually is a department under psychology that's dedicated to behavior analysis, specifically EAB, I think, too.
Yeah,
and not just behavior analysis, but EAB in particular.
And there was obviously a lot of concentrated effort put into developing our own professional organizations, such as the Association Behavior Analysis International, the Association Professional Behavior Analysts, and such, that came together. So I've actually never been to an APA convention or even visited one of these Division 25s. And I know some people that go out to those, but I do not think it is a popular venue for behavior analysts, modern behavior analysts to go to. Have you heard anyone?
I think Matt was talking about Matt Bell when we did the podcast on EAB, right?
Yeah.
He talked about Division 25.
Yeah. And my understanding is that there's definitely still this a scientific, academic minded folks that go to that, but I don't think it's anywhere near the 3,000-4,000 people that go to ABIs, CalABAs and such.
Here's something interesting. Do you consider yourself a psychologist?
No, mainly because that is like a protected term for anybody that is down there, right? So I usually steer away from it.
I know. That's why it's so weird to watch this. But anyway, let's keep going.
Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award, and now this, but really the greatest honor in my life. I am extremely grateful. It has been suggested that I might make a few remarks in return,
It's sense of humor, man.
Psychologists, following the philosophers, have looked inside themselves for explanations of their behavior. They have felt their feelings and observed their states of mind and mental processes through introspection. Introspection has never been a very satisfactory process. Philosophers have acknowledged its defects, but argued that nevertheless it is the only way to self-knowledge. The psychologists try to improve it. Wundt and Titchener particularly invented brass instruments, as William James called them, to present stimuli, the effects of which were to be introspected, and they trained observers. A trained observer, for example, could see red without seeing it as a red object. That was a stimulus error. Watson, of course, attacked introspection in his Manifesto of 1913, and I suppose you could say he was successful because, at any rate, psychologists have stopped introspecting almost entirely.
So you got to think about that. So Watson wrote that in 1913. The First World War was 1917. And that was just over 100 years ago. Talk about youthful science, right?
Yeah.
Like that. So like, and Watson was methodological, right? So I mean, like, forget, what 1936 was behavior organisms. So I mean, like, it's just when you put things in context and you look at the historical framework you're operating from, I think it really does kind of like set the stage for, number one, how young our science is, but number two, just like, man, we're not that far away from like who we would call our Newtons or like great minds of the field. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
like mathematicians are operating from like Pythagoras from 2,500 years ago. and we're operating from Skinner and, like, well, 1990 was this. I mean, like, 47 minutes ago, really, if you think about it in the context of deep time.
Cognitive psychologists probably see the representations of reality they talk about. In fact, they say that's all you possibly can see. But I don't think they claim to see themselves processing them, storing them in memory, retrieving them, and so on. Instead, they have resorted to theories. Theories about what is going on in the head or the mind. But theories have to be confirmed, and the question is, how can you be sure a theory is right until you can see what it's a theory about? Well, as you know, most of them have turned for that to brain science.
It's so funny how like that's such a backhanded thing to say, and like like they clapped a little bit and they were like, wait a second.
I was gonna say it's they straight up like welcomed Skinner in, gave him this award, and he couldn't, I don't think, be much farther away conceptually or theoretically from the majority of the people who are sitting in the audience, right?
Dude, 4 minutes and 5 seconds into it, he just insulted all of them. He said, everything you do is theory. You can't prove it. What you've done is you resorted to neuroscience to justify your theoretical position.
Yeah, it makes what I was getting at is like, it's interesting that they opened the doors for him in the first place to kind of get why they may maybe feel like they have to, given his contributions on things. But it's going to be interesting to see how he delivers the speech and how he uses that stage, given most of the times he had a giant stage. It was usually to just outright say things are incorrect. This is how it should be, right?
Dude, and that's the thing. Like, what I love about this whole thing is that, and I don't know, is the recording going to show the video or show us talking?
Just us talking.
Oh, okay. That's unfortunate. You should go watch the video if you want, if you're interested, because like I can't help but get this sense of sarcasm the whole time. It's like he's just being a little bit facetious underneath there's an undercurrent of sarcasm.
I think folks like him and Kantor, J.R. Kantor, like they were trolls, man, in the sense of like, if like we try to suppress that stuff in some of our forums and whatnot now, but like that's what these dudes did.
He's trolling hard right now.
And they backed it up with their their research and their data and such. But yeah, trolls, dude.
Big time. Oh, and by the way, if you, we said you were going to raise your hand to get me to talk for me to pause it for you, but like my screen is to my right or my left. So if I'm watching it, I can't see.
You're good. This is good. I'll just remember my points as you pause.
Just say something.
Mind is what the brain does. And the brain can be inspected rather than introspected like any other organ.
Oh, man.
But does the brain really initiate behavior as the mind or self was said to do? The brain is part of an organism, and what it does is simply part.
Let's pause here for a sec.
Of what the.
So I was having a conversation the other day on a Discord server with some younger behavior analysts. Like, when I say younger, like I don't know what the hell their age is, but people are kind of coming up and learning in the field and stuff like that. And there's a few of us all chatting about the different waves of cognitive behavioral therapy. So I just want to add in a little bit of layer here for anybody that isn't abreast of that. Essentially, behaviorism, this 1913 kind of Skinnerian, all this revolution starts to happen. We get a lot of behavior analysis, and behaviorism is like the dominant form of thinking. I would say up until, I don't know the exact, there's not like a set date, but the 50s, 60s, and it starts to
pretty much post World War II.
Yeah, it starts to shift over a couple decades into the second wave of behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is what he's really attacking right here. And this is Beck and these others that we're looking at what most behavior analysts label as mentalism or mentalisms or mentalistic approach. But what's since kind of happened is a little bit of a third wave starting up and shifting to where acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, functional analytic psychotherapy all have behavioral components again. So it's kind of like behavior analysis sometimes is labeled as like our APBA therapy. It's like, hey, we're like now in our heyday, things are going. It's like, no, we had a heyday. No. We were the dominant frame and the way in which people thought for decades. And then there was a really strong pushback and critique on it. And that's where Skinner lived, over half of his career, right? Probably half of his life of like, I would say this slow decline and
loss of status.
Yeah, loss of status in the sense of behaviorism not being the dominant viewpoint.
Dude, he was the most important psychologist of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Like literally, according to Science Magazine. So I mean, like,
yeah,
in time.
So anyhow, like the context here is he's talking to people that essentially, I would say, like overthrew the dominant frame of thinking and are the most popular frame of thinking.
For me, what I love is that he did two things there. Number one is he talked about introspection, and then he also talked about how it relates to philosophers. And like, really, if you don't understand, like attaching something like a science to philosophy is a huge slap in the face, because philosophy is based on deductive reasoning. So it's not based on induction. It's not empirical. It's not about science. It's about literally finding answers from oneself. It's looking within, starting with a pure idea or a notion, like Plato or Aristotle would have done, like an ideal, and then deducing from there what matters, right? So that's hypothetical deductive logic or logical positivism, which is like not how we would go about things. And what he's talking about, how like they failed at introspection, so then they decided to inspect it. And like just the play on words, it's such a beautiful dialectical move too, from like just from like rhetoric and discourse. It's like really good writing, really good public speaking too. Just like just style points there for me personally.
Let's play.
The organism does. It is part of what is to be explained. Now that explanation, I think, can only be found by looking outside the organism, the individual, rather than within. And it is found in three kinds of variation and selection. The first of these was natural selection, which explains why we have a body and a brain at all. But there was a difficulty with that. It prepares a species only for a future that resembles the selecting past. That fault was corrected by a further evolutionary step, the evolution of operant conditioning, which enabled the environment of the individual to select behavior with contingencies that were not stable enough to work through natural selection. However, one can learn very little in a solitary world by operant conditioning, but unless you have the social environment, which is a rich set of contingencies of reinforcement and responsible for the elaborate repertoires we all acquire.
This is such an amazing point that I think speaks so much to some of the stuff we're trying to get at when we're talking about on the podcast, dude. Like, that's so hard for me to just tact. So, oh man, so concisely. It's like, you have to understand that there are layers, right? It's not just like, when we talk about ABA or applied behavior analysis, right? We're talking about operant conditioning. So we're talking about that learned layer. And then a lot of the discussions or conversations that you see with people online, or even just in general with practitioners and stuff, they come from that point of view. And like, part of the reason why they arrive or come to false conclusions a lot of the time, or like leads to frustration in conversation, is because it's limited, because it's only putting organisms in that singular context. Yep. So we have to have a multi-layered discussion. It's tiered out, right? So like, we're not just organisms living in our environment, because that just becomes like that becomes like we are tabula rasa, what they would say, which is a blank slate, which is not necessarily the case. We're not purely blank slates. We also have what would be called our genetic endowment, is what he's referred to it before, or our biology, which is the result of natural selection. It's still selection by consequences. It just occurs over macro periods of time, right? So then you have selection by consequences in terms of macro periods of time that affect biology and morphology, so physiology. But if you just take that by itself, you get mechanism and reductionism. So we're not just that. If you just take operant conditioning in and of itself, you get like people existing in a vacuum and tabula rasa, and we're not that either. So then like, you have to add the third layer, which is what? Context. That's what he's talking about, right? It's contextual behavior science. It's like these layers that are necessary in order to provide a comprehensive framework, a comprehensive discussion, a comprehensive understanding of the human condition, dude. It's what a wonderful, concise way to put it.
That's the stuff that's clearly not being trained as intensely as it was 15, 20 years and beyond ago, right? Like that's hard to find in a training program without going into like a PhD level, right? Like,
dude, absolutely.
I would say almost all master's programs are missing this. Even if they touch on it, that appreciation and true subscription, I would say, to a contextual viewpoint is not the primary dominant approach.
Yeah.
It might be appreciated, but it's not that all behavior analysts are living by it day to day.
I mean, what's hilarious is this is the founder of radical behaviorism, but he's actually describing a functional contextualist point of view, really.
Yeah, and that's where so functional contextualism for folks is really the wing of like where ACT and RFT is coming from, this acceptance commitment therapy and relational frame theory. And what they did is they basically just kind of took radical behaviorism, kind of sharpened up the edges and kind of cleaned it up a little bit and said, this is really what it was. And the idea there was Skinner had worked on developing his radical behaviorism slowly through his investigations in his life, really. About behaviorism was written in 1974, right? So his essentially was a bottom-up, conduct research, whatnot, start to develop this philosophy and theories around things. Whereas what functional contextualism did is, I look at it as like piggybacked off of his work, said let's sharpen up some of the edges and clear up some of the things philosophically, and then let's move forward. So I think there's it's like functional contextualism is like the I don't know, cousin of,
I would almost say grandchild, actually.
Yeah.
It's a direct
grandchild
lineage.
would be a good way to put it.
Yeah, it's the grandchild. It's the natural step of taking all the elements of the previous two and combining them in such a way where it necessarily amalgamates all those point of view and puts them into one cohesive framework.
Which is not the popular opinion of people that are traditional Skinnerian or radical behaviorists. They would say, "Oh no, that went too far."
Yeah,
just to clarify for folks listening.
But yeah, I mean, if when you get into RFT and stuff, I think that's what they say that. But in terms of like talking about the environment in itself being like part of the being, I don't know if that's
you know one of my favorite things to do when I'm talking with people like at conferences and whatnot, especially people that are more on this hard, staunch, radical behaviorism Skinnerian approach, is to see where their functional contextual thinking is and like where their mechanistic thinking is and all of that. Because oftentimes what happens is you have people critique the functional contextual approach and they lean to more mechanistic tendencies.
I know, it's wild.
Or they're, you know what I mean? And it's just like, but if you ask them, they're like, no, I'm a hardcore radical behaviorist. And it's like, well, you can literally have evidence of the way in which you logically get to places that you're not in this context a radical behaviorist, but you may claim to be. So there's these disconnects, right?
Well, it's here's the thing, man. People get married to the idea of direct contingencies in a way that's crazy. That's part of it too. You know what I mean? Like they don't see the idea that like indirect contingencies are just as influential as direct contingencies, right? So like when you're stuck in this operant framework, and by operant we mean SD, behavior response, right? Like that specific framework in a person's lifetime of the skills and behaviors that change and alter as a result of direct contact with the environment, right? And if you're married to that as like the singular perspective of how people are, which we know is not the only thing that influences, right? We know that's the thing that we influence as behavior practitioners because that's what we can control. But it's wrong to say that that's what a complete person is made from, right? That's what makes you who you are, quote unquote, right? You are actually a product of all those other things, meta contingencies from a cultural perspective. You're talking about like the idea of like natural selection being a macro contingency, and then these micro contingencies in terms of like operant learning. So like there's layers of where people are, who they are, what makes them up, and having to understand that. And like when you get stuck in a particular framework, man, you make logical mistakes that you don't even understand. So it becomes more religion than it becomes science. And that's part of the thing, you know. Ideology is dangerous, man. Part of this is like part of like the gospel that I'm trying to preach here. You know, if we want to use these types of terms, is that like don't get married to ideology, right? Get married to the facts, get married to the variables, and look at what is influencing those things to produce a much more cohesive conception of what problem you're trying to solve. And that's what he's getting at here. It's just brilliant, man. I mean, there's really no other way to put it.
Cultures also evolve, and that is the third type.
There we go.
Of variation and selection.
Culture.
Now,
which is context.
If these three external kinds of circumstances explain what the body does, then what is this mind or self supposed to be doing? Does it exist?
Pause real quick. You know, if I could ask a question of Skinner, it would be why he talked about these levels so much, but they weren't essentially put into our conceptual diagrams. So, for example, SD, MO, response, consequence. Why was there not an addition of like at least variables to make people think when they're breaking things down in direct contingencies of those sort of things? So this is where Goldiamond and J.R. Kantor specifically put in things to make you remember to think about those sort of levels, right? And they were built in there. So it's like almost like our predominant way of our predominant way of thinking said these are important, but didn't build them into certain systems, right?
Yeah, I think there's a 5-turn contingency. There's the inner behaviorism. Yeah, there are models. We just don't teach them.
Well, that's it. It's like, well, and that would be my question for him. It's like if this is so important to always hit on the head. I mean, this was published in Science, those 3 levels.
Dude, I know. That's true. You're absolutely right.
Right? Like, why weren't they fit in there? And my question would be like, where did we go wrong as a culture then to kind of like let that stray away and not because I mean, if you look at almost anybody's starting point, what is it? Do an ABC analysis.
I know.
You know, and like the idea of rule out medical first, which you're supposed to do before you even do that, is because of these different levels.
Yeah, rule out medical is about natural selection. It's a macro contingency, right?
Yeah,
it's biology.
Yeah, and I'm not. I would legit just like to ask Skinner what that is. I've asked other people live during this time, like Steve Hayes, some questions like that, where it's like, hey man, what do you think? I'm like, why this decision wasn't made, and I've asked him specifically about some things when it comes to training of ACT practitioners, and he'll just be like, we didn't even foresee the issue coming up, or it's like, hey, we realized we made an error and we're trying to adjust it. So it would have been interesting to see like what his thoughts were on that.
There's a lot of assumptions about what people think about stuff, and like it goes back to that procedural versus conceptual understanding thing. You know what I mean? It's a lot of assumptions.
There seems to be no room for it in a scientific account. You can say it is explained by contingencies of selection and in turn explains behavior, but that isn't necessary. You can skip the thing entirely. Well, let's
Smack.
start.
Smack.
Ruthless. This is a long way off.
So hilarious.
I was gonna say, yeah, like this is something we chuckle at, but it was having me think of beforehand. There's research from a behavioral approach in the 50s done looking at this us versus them mentality. And if you have an us versus them mentality, what's most likely to happen is you further push the groups apart.
Polarization.
And so the question is like, when do you sit on your horse and like ride that horse versus like, when would you not do that? Right? Because
I will
we
not
laugh,
go
we laugh now, but like,
good night, he says, sir.
We laugh now, but was this the beginning of, or like a further ingrain, not the beginning, like, was this just further ingraining this behavior analysis being so violently opposed in traditional psychology or, psychology programs?
I don't see it that way. I know this is where like someone's going to claim that I'm being biased. Okay. And that's fine. But I mean, like, I think there's what he just provided. And here's the thing, going back to critical thinking, man, there's like induction and deduction in the marriage of the two, man. You do induction, and this was his life. He engaged in induction. He engaged in pure science. He collected data for years to explain certain underlying first principles. And by first principles, I'm talking about the equivalent of Newtonian mechanics for how people operate, dude. We're talking about gravity, okay? We're not talking about like the perception of a construct of like the ego and the superego. We're talking about this guy proved the human equivalent, the organismic equivalent of gravity for how we learn. Oh, it's an undeniable fact on the way that organisms behave, like and acquire skills and information. So if you once you identify first principles and then you build from there a conceptual framework, and then you explain it and provide it, that's taking induction. So that's evidence, that's facts, that's science, and then producing a deductive argument for presenting the information. It's how you present information in a cohesive, sound manner. So he does both. Rather than engage in philosophy, which would be the hypothetical deductive thing, right? Have a hypothesis and then go to prove it, right? He engaged in a deductive practice. He acquired the data. He demonstrated certain ideas that are basic and undebatable, basically, right? They're facts. Operant conditioning is a fact. And then he provided the conceptual framework that put it in a cohesive narrative. So then it's a lot more difficult to refute it, because then it's underpinned by all the facts, and it follows a clear logical thread that permits you to project certain ideas. And that's the best kind of science. That's the best kind. That's how physics does it, man. Right? Physics starts from first principles. There's an Elon Musk quote where he's like, I don't care if people have degrees to work at Tesla. Like, he'll hire people without degrees. He doesn't care. What matters is that if they're able to make decisions based on first principles. Because if you're making decisions based on first principles, then you're making sound decisions over time, because you're basing them on the facts that you have in front of you, rather than some specific ideological bias that you're trying to bring to the table. So that's kind of the point that I think he's making here, that we need to have more conversation of in the field. This is why we do the podcast, man. Like, take your red pill and get out of the matrix, folks. Listen to this.
So check this out. I just found it. It was the number of, they call it Skinner's research induction ratio. So it's in a book by Ogden Lindsley called Skinner on Measurement. And he has a table in there. So he looks at the publication date of the 1938 Behavior of Organisms and the 1957 Schedules of Reinforcement. And so 1938 took 6 years to work on that project. They collected 4,000 charts, 4,000 individual experiments were run, and 99 of those were published. So it was a 40-to-1 ratio of like what made it into there. And then in 1957, Schedules of Reinforcement with Ferster, 7 years, 70,000 individual subjects and like charts were ran to be able to do that. So, and there was 896 published in that one. So it was a 78-to-1. But if you're thinking about collect 70,000 individual subjects, like behavior patterns, to be able to make your statements, like that's the level of commitment to the science that was put into it. So I do see why he was so adamant on this perspective, right? And I wasn't trying to question that, Dimitri. It was more so like, what implications did this have on further dividing the two fields? Was it already done?
But I mean, here's the thing. Like, and this, for me, it's more like within field versus out of field discussion. For me, I feel like we even have a split within the field.
Yeah.
Because I made a comment about OTs on the internet in the last month that set some people on fire, where someone literally said to me, "This is why people hate us." No, this is not. People don't hate us because we take hard stands. People hate us because we can't actually explain why our hard stance matters. And he's actually clarifying his hard stance, not because it's his fucking opinion. It's because it's a fact. So like, for me, certain things, I'm willing to compromise and debate certain things, of course, like answer. And I'm willing to state, this is my opinion versus this is a fact, right? Like certain things, if they're a fact, like, this is a societal issue that we're running to at this point, right? Like we don't need to agree on the facts. They are what they are. You can disagree with them if you'd like, but they are what they are. And I'm personally not willing to compromise on that. And in field, those who are willing to compromise to gain status or access or jobs, you know, that compromise is what weakens everybody else's position, right? Solidarity in terms of conceptual framework, but also necessarily empiricism in and of itself is what's necessary for us to progress our field. Again, now that is my opinion. That is not a fact.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's where I get kind of passionate and frustrated about some of these conversations. And that's why I want to do these reaction videos, because, you know, they should come from the words of other people that if people don't respect what I have to say, that's fine.
Yeah.
What you respect what he has to say, he's taking a stance. Like, his opinion matters. He's the father of what we do, and also he's got 70,000 data points plus on why he's right. So let's disagree with those facts.
Just for that one book.
Just for that one book. P.S.
Dude, it was said in that book. I don't know the exact. Where is it? It was over 250 million responses in that schedules of reinforcement were collected.
Yeah, like. How can anyone possibly argue with the results? That is not some BS, you know, JABA publication with variability where they played with the perception of what you're seeing in the graph, you know what I mean, and got published for whatever reasons. This is like legitimate outcomes. So.
And Pavlov's 1928, while I have it up here, 537,000 experiments were conducted over the 14 years.
Yeah.
To be able to look at respondent conditioning like that.
Unreal.
Everyone talks about behavior and did so long before there were philosophers or scientists of any kind. We all speak. It's a vernacular. It's a proper word to call it. A vernacular is not pejorative. It means, as the root meant for the Romans, the language of the household, of daily life. We all speak it. It is a language in which newspapers, magazines, and books are published. It's the language of radio, television. When they are talking about the individual, it is a language used by psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, and economists, all the behavioral sciences. It is the language used.
Can I just say 1 second here? Notice how he put in poli-sci, economics into the notion of behavioral sciences. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah. Well, that was it. He's just trying to say it's
all
everywhere.
Behavior. Everything is behavior is the point.
And the interesting thing that he talks about in his writings too is the fact it's kind of like this double-edged sword. Like it's in one context, that's really cool. But on the other side, everybody then thinks they're necessarily an expert just from a history of reinforcement of trying to understand their behavior,
right? And
being in a culture that's trying to understand influence behavior, right? So,
yeah.
By professionals, when they deal with their clients, for the very simple reason it is the only language the clients understand. Now, the very curious thing about that language, the vernacular, refers very richly to feelings and states of mind. So that there is some reason to suspect that we are back with what psychologists have been looking for. However, if you examine the terms in the vernacular, you'll find that each one has a double meaning. I say, I'm hungry, and I think I'll get something to eat. Now, what am I saying? Am I mentioning a feeling, hunger, and am I talking about some cognitive process called thinking, or am I conveying to someone something about my personal history? To say I am hungry is to say, among other things, I haven't eaten for some time. To say I am hungry, among other things, says, if you give me some food, I'll probably eat it. The terms in the vernacular which seem to refer to feelings and states of mind are really talking about contingencies of reinforcement, about the world and about its effect on people. 3 years ago, I published a paper in the American Psychologist. I've had too great a share of that journal, I'm afraid. But it was called The Origins of Cognitive Thought. And in it, I considered perhaps 70 or 80 words, each of which referred, on the one hand, to a mental process of some kind, but on the other, to a purely physical kind of thing, either to the kind of situation in which a person finds himself or herself, or the contingencies which are operating to select behavior appropriate to that situation. There are, in my own experience, some 1,500 words that have that double meaning. Now, what has happened, I think, is that psychology has split in two ways. One part going in the direction of finding out the essence of the feeling, the essence of the cognitive process, and the other going in the direction of references to contingencies of reinforcement. The psychologist who is a professional, who is a practitioner, uses the vernacular of his or her clients to find out more about what has happened to them and what they are probably going to do. The psychologist who claims to be a scientist, investigating, searching for an inner originating, creative, or initiating self, is quite different and is doing quite different things. What has happened, I think, is that psychology has advanced as a practice, as a profession, far more rapidly than as a science.
There's a lot there.
What a flipping smack in the mouth.
Yeah, and I think this could even be said to our field, man. Like, how many people truly take a behavioral worldview and subscribe to it and don't let dualistic worldview slide in there to where there's some other, entity, whether that's a religious perspective or spiritual or whatever, right?
Oh, dude, it's so much more than that, though. Being able to distinguish between the everyday language and the technological terminology that matters in terms of like what things mean in relation to scientific process, an actual explanation versus how to articulate how can someone make it useful for themselves in their daily lives, like when they're not necessarily functioning in that capacity, right?
Yeah.
And I think, again, it just like it sets the stage for why I'm so passionate about this. I think why we're both so passionate about having these conversations all the time is like, it's not going to work. Like we can't fight wars and battles on all these different fronts. You know what I mean? It's one thing if we're going to fight with psychologists or disagree or fight, you know what I mean? Like, have this like healthy discourse with psychologists or have healthy discourse with other types of disciplines, OTs, speech or whatever. But then when we bring it over to the side, having the same conversation internally, if you're going to be this, you have to have a foundational, a conceptual foundational framework that you're operating from that matters. you know, and being able to articulate and walk both paths matters. But so like, I just feel like what he's pointing out here is that like, there is a distinction between those two things, and conflating them is a huge error. It's a huge mistake. It's not just a logical error. It's an empirical problem. And I think that if you need to come to grips with that, and you have to put the work in to have that understanding of what we're talking about when you're talking about it. And it just matters so much, dude. I mean, the big thing, like when he talks about getting to the essence of things, right? And I think that's where some of the debate goes into the contextual stuff you're talking about with RFT or ACT, where people get worried, is bringing out these outside people who are getting a vernacular. They're getting a colloquial understanding of these words, you know, the daily use of terms, and then they're applying it, and then they're misconstruing it. They're miscategorizing it, which again is a logical fallacy. It's called a category mistake. It's called an apples and oranges comparison, where you take one thing and you make it another thing, but you confuse it as the same thing. And us not being able to tack that out loud and have that, or if you do tact it, you're viewed, again, you're socially censored, or you're viewed as like some, you know, shit stirrer or controversial character, when in reality, you're simply trying to set the record straight. Yeah. You know, that's, man, like, I mean, this statement just like, it hits me in a place, man. I don't even know how to put it. Like, I'm just blown away by him. Because I feel if anyone other than him said that shit, and maybe he didn't live in the internet era. So maybe if this if he was alive today, and like this was on whatever YouTube, which it is on YouTube now, but if he was alive to defend himself on YouTube, like maybe the shitstorm would have hit him as well, and who knows, he would not have survived it. But like, I didn't know. He always dealt with shitstorms. Like that was part of his career. It was like make a statement that was not the popular opinion, then deal with it. Like that's how he ended up on the Times cover. Yeah, about beyond freedom and dignity. You know, unbelievable. I mean, what a statement though. Like how many like ABA school provider people or like whatever folks would have literally potentially had to change their underpants from shitting themselves from listening to a statement like that. Because he's not necessarily, he's literally saying, listen, like your thinking is wrong. Like your thinking is wrong. Like you're not a bad person. This is not a character assassination, but the way that you're articulating and you're thinking and conceptualizing this idea is factually incorrect, and you should adjust your position. And that's what I was trying to get at. Is like really learning the assumptions and like putting on the hat and living day by day, second by second, like from that perspective, is rare, I think, in today's day and age of what he's asking for. Unbelievable. What a statement, though. God, loving it right now. And what's so ironic is that like I'm not like usually such a Skinner fanboy, but like I'm totally fanboying out right now.
Began as a science. It began as an effort to discover what was going on inside the mind or the self. But as the membership of this organization shows, it was the people who were interested in that particular topic soon became a minority. They were not only replaced by the professionals, but by psychologists who didn't care too much about what was going on inside, but were interested in behavior, not necessarily as behaviorists, in teaching, psychology, clinical psychology, developmental psychology, and so on. And
pause right here. Isn't this not exactly what you hear from traditional Skinnerians right now about the field of behavior analysis and how it's being lost? Real though, right? It's what you hear, dude. It's what we're seeing, right? We're seeing this practice gap divide, where to me, I see what I hear is look at the task list. It's completely tailored to people who work in developmental disabilities and autism, which is fine, right? But it does create this misconception that that's what behavior analysis is. And no, that's what a particular exercise and practice of behavior analysis is, but that is not the same thing. There's a false equivalence occurring as a result of introducing these clinical aspects of actual application, when maybe not, number one, the training programs and training protocol hasn't caught up to that or isn't necessarily been well established enough to be able to do that. And number two, maybe the conceptual framework isn't ready. Maybe it's not ready yet, you know? Yeah. And he literally is describing how that happened, what that did to psychology, and that's created the conditions for what we have now, which is like such it's out there explanations of like
mind body splits and dualism and mentalism that just like it literally controls the entire framework of what people think of when they hear the word psychology. And then like you equate that to within we're having the same now kind of like schism, I would say, in our own field again. So it's like there's this continuous break from like the conceptual thing where people just are not unwilling to meet the results where they are. They want to add more because they're unsatisfied by it, because the conclusions can be unsatisfying, especially if they conflict with your current worldview.
That's it. Well stated, man.
Oh man, unbelievable.
Those became important sciences quite apart from an effort to isolate an originating mind or self. The whole notion of selection by consequences seems extremely difficult to understand. We've seen what has happened in evolution. It is still true that biology cannot be properly taught in America because those who call themselves creationists or creation scientists oppose it as some kind of threat. If I say that psychologists, in searching for this inner self or mind, have wasted their time, you may feel that I am being arrogant. If I say that the philosophers who, over the centuries, have tried to discover themselves in that sense, that I am being arrogant. But I would call your attention to the fact that equally or even more brilliant men and women over a much longer period of time have been trying to establish the existence of and the nature of a different creator, in this case spelled with a capital C. Now, that is a very great problem. And you know how difficult it has been for natural selection to be accepted. Imagine how difficult it is going to be for the individual selection by consequences of operant behavior, or the other in evolution of cultures and the other kinds of selection which take over the role of a creative self or mind. So far as I'm concerned, cognitive science is the creationism of psychology. It is an effort to
Whoa.
I wonder how many of the audience members were like there knowing that Skinner was getting this and it altered the claps and whatnot.
I don't know, man. I feel like the APA is a pretty big organization. I would imagine that's a pretty big hall in there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I'm assuming
that was like 17 people clapped. So I mean, like,
I was assuming that was the 0.1% that were behavior analysts in front.
You know, so like, you know, I mean, but wow, like he literally equated cognitivism to creationism, superstition, to religious ideological belief. That's how, again, to use the word preposterous, it is. You know what I mean? And how like it's not arrogant to make that statement. It's a simple statement of fact. You know, oh man, wow, unbelievable. If you listen to this and it doesn't take your breath away and doesn't jack you the fuck up to want to like crush and like know what you're talking about and not put up with some of the BS that we have to swallow in some of these meetings, like I don't know, you don't have a soul, man. You're not in it for the right reasons. Like this should make you want to be like, no, I appreciate what you're saying, but no, because there's so many keyboard activists out there that are talking all this shit. But I mean, like, why don't they talk shit for the stuff that matters like this, in my opinion? Like, this stuff matters to me. Like, this is stuff that we should be arguing over.
It's becoming, I think, less okay to be able to put opinions out there like this. Like, dude, if you went in there and wrote this in a comment section in a Facebook group.
Oh my God, I'm telling you, I did it with OT. I called OT's magic not too long ago.
But if you
and I said it sarcastically, and literally, dude, 200 comments. It got deleted. Like people were pissed.
If I wrote that I'm like uncomfortable that behavior analysts juggle both like creationism and behavior analysis simultaneously, I'd probably be kicked out or just like of certain groups and lynched for it, right? As being like insensitive, blah, 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 whatnot. But like, that's our roots here, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's why I don't get it. Like, I mean, wow. But I mean, it's true though, right? I mean, as far as if you want to really, if you take everything to the most, if you really look at the arguments, if you really look at these ideas and you really do break them down, you know, and you scratch at the surface and all you're left with is nothing, then how can you possibly accept it as a position? Like, and if you're going to make, again, this goes back to the type of arguments that get made. Let's go back to dialectic logic. Another type of logical error that one makes is appeals to emotion, right? But that might hurt their feelings. Or where's your compassion? You know what I mean? That's their experience. Again, whenever there's a criticism of an idea, that's not an invalidation of a person's lifespan or belief structure in terms of like how it makes them feel. It's an invalidation of the validity of the argument that justifies it as truth.
But that's a different thing. Like, that's not trained largely in the BA culture right now.
It should be though.
It should be, but it's not. But the reality is,
and that's not about. But then here's the thing, though. Like, then the BA culture should stop calling itself science. That's the point that I'm making, and I think that's the point that he's making.
That's some of the arguments made by people right now. Like Hank Schlinger will argue that like the science is not. It needs to be called something else now. Like when I talk to them,
he's right though. That's something that I kind of agree with him on. Now his bone is about the contextual stuff, and that's not where my personal like problem is. But I mean, like because I have no problem with the contextual portion of it. My issue is more with the applied world and how it's just like totally off the rails in terms of connection to it, especially when you go to some of these, like, I'm going to actually say it, some of the, like the hyper, how do I put this without saying something super offensive? Some of the conversation surrounding like escape extinction and like talking about aversives or punishment and like the way that they're framed, you know, and conflating discussing them as advocacy for those things necessarily. Like, that's the kind of stuff that's like a disingenuous argumentation that are appeals to emotion, which is a logical fallacy, which is an unscientific position. It's not, you know what I mean, an assassination, a character assassination or a personal attack, or what one would call an ad hominem, which if you make a personal attack on a person, that's called an ad hominem, which is also a logical fallacy. Logical fallacies undermine your argument and make them pointless. It makes you wrong just in lieu of making the statement. So it's not dismissing you, it's dismissing your argument. I just think it's great, man. It's fantastic.
Agreed. That's what I was commenting on. I was like, that's just not our culture. Like
you're right. You're right. It's not
at all.
It's pathetic though. It makes me sad, man. It literally hurts my heart. It literally hurts my heart.
To reinstate that inner initiating, originating, creative self or mind, which in a scientific analysis simply does not exist.
Boom goes the dynamite.
I think this association has been through a recent trial just because of this difference. It has, as you know, suffered a kind of secession by cognitive psychologists who are unhappy when they associate with so many practitioners. And I would regard it not as a secession, but as an improvement. I think it is time for psychology as a profession and as a science in such fields as psychotherapy, education, developmental psychology, and all the rest. It is time to realize that the science which will be most helpful is not cognitive science searching for the inner mind or self, but selection by consequences represented by behavior analysis.
Man, I'm glad you guys left.
Looking back on my life of 62 years as a psychologist, I would say that what I have tried to do, what I've been doing, is to make that point clear, to show how selection by consequences in the individual can be demonstrated in the laboratory, with animals and with human subjects, and to show the implications of that for the world at large, in not only the profession of psychology, but in consideration of what is going to happen to the world unless some very vital changes are made. Any evidence that I've been successful in that is what I should like to be remembered by. Once again, thank you for this award and for your attention.
On August 18, 1990, 8 days after delivering the keynote address at APA's 98th Annual Convention, Burris Frederick Skinner died at Mount Auburn Hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Give it a pause there.
Wow. Powerful, man.
Yeah. Talk about a stage as one of your last stages, man.
Unbelievable, dude. Powerful, man. What a powerful. I mean, I have goosebumps right now. I have actual goosebumps listening to that.
Do you know what his last words said?
No, what were they?
Marvelous.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was after he sipped a glass of water right before he passed. He was like, marvelous. And that's, I think about that word all the time when I'm watching cool stuff like this, historical pieces like this.
Yeah, man.
I'm just like, marvelous, man. Like, there's no other word.
That's good. The only person's last words I know are John Madison's. His last words were "Jefferson lives."
Yeah.
Wow, marvelous. Well, I'm going to steal that now. That's going to be that should be our closing statement. Marvelous.
Marvelous.
That's a controversial exchange. Marvelous.
It's written in one of his. I think there was a paper published by him after his death because he was working on a paper and they added that as an anecdote. There's something like that as like part of the story. And that's how it was kind of captured. Yeah, good stuff, man.
Well, dude,
what'd you think? What are your closing thoughts?
I mean, for me, it's more like, I think we'll do a end of the year recap, and like part of like this whole looking at these new episodes we're doing because we're coming off of our big break. But I think for me, it's more like, and we're going to do more reaction videos like this because he's not the only one that's made great conversations. Like there's a Murray Sidman one that we're going to watch that hopefully will knock people's socks off too. But, I guess for me, it's more like, it's not controversial to speak the truth. Like it's not controversial to hold a position that's rooted in empiricism. It's not controversial to believe what you believe based on the facts that you see in front of you and to hold steady to them. And it's not confrontational. It's not polemics. You're not fighting, right? It's not. Yeah. And I don't just disagree. I find it offensive that to take a position based on facts and evidence is become now in some capacity considered like shit stirring or trolling. And I think it's hilarious and problematic that we are existing in a community of practitioner scientists, supposedly, that's an offense or that's considered controversial or edgy, because I mean, for me, my goal is not to be an edgelord. I don't care about being edgy. I care about speaking I care about having the best possible position based on the best possible argument, based on the best facts available. My position is being a pragmatist. And right now, the most pragmatic position to me is to be behavior analytic. And that means to hold this position. So like that should, and if you want to claim the same mantle and you want to hold that, and that wants to be your moniker, then I think that should be your position as well. And we should disseminate that together and preach that gospel and not allow ourselves to be overtaken by opportunism, by the need for acceptance, and recognition and access, because I think that when you do that, you start losing track of what the point of what we're trying to accomplish here is. And that is to really prove a theory of everything, a theory of being. That's really what this is, And,
yeah.
And like, how do you get to those answers if you don't hold steady to the facts? I don't think you can. And if you want to, if those aren't the answers you're interested in, you should pick a different name for what you are.
Well said, man. I don't know. It's clear the times have changed drastically, but they're all so similar.
Dude, it's
if anything, this stuff just, if anything, cognitivism, I think, has just bled more and more into behavior analysis slowly. as a lack of not focusing on really training this perspective up to fluency and like actually holding ourselves to this rigor.
Marvelous.
All right, that's where we're gonna end it, y'all.
Love it.
As always, write in, all that sort of jazz.
Everything. Like, share, quote, comment. Can't wait to hear from you.
Appreciate it. Peace.
Peace.